Now, with the introduction of the Asteria map with the launch of Fortnite Chapter 4, there is absolutely 0 returning POIs, which a lot of players would say is a bad thing, but honestly, I think it's a good thing because it lets me and hopefully you guys learn a lot more about the locations this chapter and be able to really analyze them and create the perfect drop. So hopefully with this video, it can help you guys make an educated opinion on where your next drop spot is going to be in Chapter 4 Season 1. Shattered Slabs is a mess, and I'm not just talking about how it looks. Playing in the location, it feels like garbage. There's so many intricate angles where your enemies can shoot you from. Like for example, you could be trying to reboot your teammates, and then there'd just be this one guy sitting up on the hill on the other side of the location, but because the elevation is so much higher on his end, he can see you on the other side of the reboot van and get a proper angle with like a rocket launcher or something like that and kill you. Especially in zero build, it feels really unfair. On top of all of that, the POI is incredibly spacious with little chests to make up for how open it is. Only having 14 chests that aren't Oathbound ones, making it the lowest in the season right behind the Citadel that has 16. The only redeeming factor about this location is probably the shock rocks being the only place on the map that can be found as of currently. But aside from a couple challenges and being pretty fun to mess around with, the shock rocks aren't anything more than just a gimmick to get people to land here. Brutal Bastion suffers from many of the problems that haunted the Sanctuary and Synapse Station. It is just really boring, I find. The building shape's boring, the color scheme's just gray with darker gray, and it's, in the front of it at least, it's just surrounded by this really open and just empty snowy tundra with little chests in the surrounding areas. There's also a massive mountain behind it, which makes it pretty easy to just hop on top of there after hitting one of the launch pads that are built into the location and just pick off the teams that are out in the open. Speaking of being out in the open, this location fixes that a lot. There is almost nowheres inside of this actual location except for the center itself where you can be shot from openly. Everywhere else is either covered in either a wall or a railing which you can slide to get behind. Also, with the addition of the shockwave hammer and the guardian shield, alongside the built-in launch pads that I mentioned before, it's near impossible to die at this location unless you're really bad at the game, which could be a plus for some of the not as skilled players out there because it's really easy to just rotate away into circle or just away from a fight if you're stuck in a quick pickle. But what this location lacks in gameplay and looks, it almost kind of makes up for in chests, having 26, which isn't the best. As you'll see later on in this list, there's some locations that have, I think, 53. But yeah, it's just not the best location. Lonely Labs can be described as a slightly worse Frosty Flights. Its positioning is awful, but that's not really a problem considering the fact that the map is 40% smaller, making running to the next zone less of an issue than in previous chapters. Like with Chapter 3, when you would drop at, for example, Logjam Lumberyard, chances are you'd have to run halfway across the map just to get the first zone. Back then, it would take around a minute of your game to get to the next zone if it was really unlucky. Now, if it's really unlucky, it only takes around 30 seconds. Even if it's the furthest possible zone away from Lonely Labs, it still won't take that long to run there. Even compared to back in Chapter 1 with Frosty Flights, I remember when you would drop there back in Chapter 1, you'd basically always be screwed because you'd have to climb up this massive steep cliff and then you'd have to run a minute and a half just to get the first zone. Even though it's almost never in first zone, it has quite a large amount of chests, having 26 for such a small POI. For comparison, Salty Springs, which was a slightly bigger POI, whenever they expanded the gas station back in Chapter 2, only had 15 chests. Your chances of being third-partied here as well are also basically zero because it's so far away from all the rest of the action. The closest POI to this location is Brutal Bastion, and when you drop Brutal Bastion, your main worry is to rotate to either Slappy Shores or rotate more central to a POI like Anvil Square where you can be safe from the storm. And also taking into the fact that it's on an iceberg that you really have to go out of your way to get to. I really haven't gotten third-partied here at all this season. But that's the thing. Because you have to go out of your way to get to this POI, you'll almost never see anyone besides either bots or like a team practicing for competitive, because Lonely Labs is a pretty decent drop spot considering no one lands there. It does make for a pretty boring start to your game, but for worse players, it's a really, really good start. I wouldn't rule this out of anyone's list of potential drop spots, especially for competitive, but it's still not the best. Now, the Citadel can only be compared to the Agency because it's such a unique POI in terms of how it's structured, and the Agency is only really, you know, the other POI that was structured similarly to this. Now, you could argue to say the Authority was structured like this, but I don't really count that considering it was surrounded by a massive wall, and it made getting into the POI very difficult. So I'm just going to use the Agency as kind of like a golden standard comparison point here. The main thing I think the Agency did right where the Citadel does wrong is the amount of chests and where they're positioned. The Agency had 22 non-locked chests, and I'm pretty sure it had like something around like 15 locked chests, which is really good for a POI as small as the Agency. But the Citadel, although being way bigger than the Agency, only has 16 non-Oathbound ones, and I think like 15-ish Oathbound ones, only amounting to 30 chests in total, which is really not the best, because the chests, they're not all grouped up in one area, making one spot of the POI a really good drop spot. They're all spread out very spaciously, which can be a problem sometimes because there will be a bunch of people spread sporadically around the location instead of like one area for one big fight at early game. This would probably result in a drop where you'll find a gun, but everyone else would either be at full health and shield or already have a full inventory before you do, and then you'll most of the time end up dying off drop here. Speaking of dying off drop, there's a bunch of like crevices and little holes that you can fall down to that basically go from the top of the POI all the way down to the bottom of it, resulting in an instant death to fall damage, which is really not the best considering how intricate this POI is designed in. It kind of just interrupts the flow of the game, I feel like, with these just massive holes that you kind of have to avoid whenever you're in a fight, especially in zero build. This is also the only location this chapter to have a mythic boss with the Aegis champion, who drops a mythic Excalibur and a mythic Shockwave Hammer. The mythic Excalibur is absurdly strong in build mode, resulting in an instant kill if you hit a headshot, and the explosion from the sword will also damage all surrounding structures and players for about 60 damage, which is really, really good. The mythic Shockwave Hammer is also very strong considering that the purple one got nerfed midway through the season to drop the charges from 4 to 3, making the mythic Shockwave Hammer one of the strongest items in the loot pool as of currently. It's great mobility for the players who win this location. It's such a good item. The only downside to dropping here is, honestly, as I mentioned before, the extremely scarce amount of loot and how you have to kind of go out of your way sometimes to not fall to your death. Breakwater Bay, honestly, is just Starry Suburbs, but if no one landed here, which isn't a bad thing whatsoever, as this leads to a very interesting early to mid game. When Lonely Labs suffered with nobody landing here, I feel like Breakwater Bay kind of thrives considering how close the Citadel is to this location. It makes for a very quick rotation point to get to a more interesting mid game, and if you're fast enough to loot up, a really interesting early game. Breakwater Bay also has 18 chests in a very compact space. It's the second smallest location of all time, just behind Starry Suburbs, which is incredible considering how it managed to fit 16 chests. Even though this might not sound like a lot, you really have to take into consideration how small the POI is. Those 16 chests really have to be spread out evenly around the 5 buildings, making the loot never feel scarce, even though it most definitely is. Overall, I do think the only thing holding this location back from being higher on the list is that nobody lands here. And I haven't mentioned this before, and I don't think I'll mention it later because it's not really a problem in any other POIs, but the capture point in this location is kind of a death sentence if people either landed here or you didn't clear them out in time. Because the entire middle of the POI is incredibly open, and there's almost zero cover, especially in zero build. I really struggled to find a good spot for Frenzy Fields on this list. On one hand, a quarter of the lobby lands here, but on the other hand, it's so open that it honestly becomes very annoying in zero build. But I do think that this is a good enough spot for it, because Frenzy Fields does have 25 chests, which is pretty average. Even though the POI is quite large, it doesn't feel like that little amount of chests because they're all placed primarily around the main 3 hot drops of the POI. The big barn, the long barn, and the yellow house, which most players will land at, making, again, the chests not feel too scarce. Even though this location is very open, there's a lot of rocks and like cornfields you can hide in that are just slightly off the path, resulting in the players being spaced out a lot more sporadically, making for way more interesting games. And if you don't like constant action, then there's a smaller farm landmark just south of this location. Rotating to and from the landmark also isn't a problem either, as there's a massive cornfield that you can take cover in on your way there or on your way to Frenzy Farm. Also, alongside the farm landmark, there's also a huge mansion just west of Frenzy Field, which has quite a lot of chests and honestly isn't a bad drop at its own. But back to Frenzy Fields, the house, it's very weirdly designed. I've never really seen a house like this in Fortnite, and that's a really good thing because you're never safe just sitting on the roof of the house. Yes, you are protected from the front and the east, but the west and your back are completely left open, making you an easy target for people who dropped at the mansion or the smaller farm landmark. This logic also applies to the barns as well. You're never always protected while sitting on a roof. You're always exposed to either a quarter of a POI or the whole thing. This is something that I honestly had a problem with POIs in Chapter 2 and Chapter 3, especially Craggy Cliffs. I find this location did fix a lot of the problems that most of the POIs had, where you could just sit on top of the roof. And getting shot is never an issue because the roof is always pointing towards absolutely nowheres, and then the rest of it is facing a POI. I'm really glad Epic decided to design most of the locations in this way. It really makes you have to play your matches, especially in zero build, a lot more strategically, which I really do enjoy. Anvil Square is a location where you need to have a predetermined drop, or most likely you'll die off spawn, which isn't a bad thing, but it's definitely not a good thing, which is why instead of being placed second or first on the list, it's placed third. Despite this, Anvil Square still feels like Epic pulled all of the punches and designed a location absolutely perfect for competitive and zero build. The entire POI is fully accessible via mantling and tack sprint jumping, despite the massive differences in height. You truly feel like you're playing Assassin's Creed when you land here, which I personally love. On top of that, the POI has 47 chests, which is the 5th highest chest count in all of Fortnite history. which is an extremely good amount considering that Anvil Square is on the smaller side of POIs. It's not tiny, but it's definitely nowhere near the size of Faulty Splits or Slappy Shores. And honestly, these three factors add up in the best possible way. It creates a truly unique experience whenever you drop here. But despite all these positives, there's still more. The POI is almost always in the first zone, meaning you can stay here and loot for longer. Again, those 47 chests are quite a lot of loot, meaning you'll always have a blue or higher rarity inventory. There's also an absurd amount of people who land here. Again, going back to you having to have a predetermined drop spot. Yeah, there's always at least like 15 people who drop here, which it does make for a really fun game, but you do have to be communicating all the time to kind of have a chance of winning this location, especially in squads, which is a really good thing because it makes for very good practice if competitive players are trying to practice their callouts, or if a normal player is trying to practice their callouts. It's just really, really good for callouts. Now, number 2 and number 1 was really a toss-up for me because I do really enjoy both of these locations, but I think I placed them in a way that makes sense. Faulty Splits is our number 2, and it's honestly becoming sort of an icon in the Fortnite community because of its challenging terrain and intense battles. Honestly, it's such a uniquely designed POI featuring a split-level terrain with narrow pathways and vertical ziplines, connecting the steep cliff medieval part to the more like city-inspired location below. The split-level design not only adds an element of strategy to the game, but it also creates an exciting and dynamic environment for players to explore. The terrain of Faulty Splits, as mentioned before, is a mix of high cliffs, pathways, and short but long buildings. The high cliffs do provide a vantage point for players, offering a safe haven from the battles below. The zip lines, on the other hand, are very, very dangerous to go up, and you really have to pick a really good time to use the vertical zip lines. The building and medieval area offers a bunch of like different drop spot possibilities. Me personally, I like dropping at the hot dog shop just because not a lot of people go for that building, and it has a pretty decent amount of chests, not to mention it has quite a lot of slurp barrels. The choice of safety on the high ground and the lure of valuable loot on the lower levels creates an adrenaline-fueled experience that keeps players on their toes the entire time. The range of structures and the medieval landmark also offers a variety of ways to play in this location, with options for both close quarters combat, which is the area down below, and the long range sniping, which is the medieval area up above. This mix of high stakes battle and strategic terrain makes Faulty Splits a must drop location for players looking for a thrilling and challenging experience. Faulty Splits is also a great location for all skill levels. Again, the split level design offers for a challenge for experienced players, while the managing learning curve makes it accessible for newcomers, but it's definitely more of a competitive location. Whether you're just a competitive player or just starting out, I do think this location offers something for everybody. The intense battles and challenging terrain makes for a truly memorable drop that will definitely make you want to drop here again. Now, if you stuck through the whole video, you can probably guess what number 1 is. Of course, it's Slappy Shores. Slappy Shores is everything good about Chapter 1, 2, and 3 locations dialed up to 1,000. Its positioning does seem awful at first, but it's almost always in first zone, which is the exact reason why a lot of the locations people would normally say are really good are ranked quite low on this list. It's the fact that you have to run, and it kind of just interrupts the flow of the game. Even though the map is 40% smaller and it is usually in first zone, you still do have to run a little bit to get to first zone from Slappy Shores, but most of the time it is almost always in first zone, which is a very good thing. Slappy's positioning does make sense for it to be slightly further from mid, as it's meant to be a shoreline location, hence the name Slappy Shores, but it's perfectly fine. It just means that there's a higher chance of people landing here from a hot drop from the battle bus. It makes for a very fun early game, especially how this location is structured. Speaking of, the location is segmented into 2 areas. You got the factory and the like suburban, like San Francisco, Detroit location. Both of these zones do stand perfectly as a POI on their own, honestly. They're just that good. The suburban location does have the most chests out of the 2 zones, but it's in such a compact area that it's so easy to traverse. It reminds me a lot of Anvil Square, and it just feels perfect to play an in-zero build. But enough about the suburban half. How's the factory? Well, to be honest, it's still incredible. It feels like they took all the aspects that people liked about the Slurpy Swamp Factory and the Flush Factory and combined it into one beautiful mess that just works so well. Even though this half doesn't have as many chests as the suburban half, there's still more than enough loot to support at least 4 squads here. And once you do win the factory, if you drop here, it turns into a 1v1 with the team on the suburban side if you do decide to fight them for the rest of the loot in the location. It's always just such a fun transitional point from mid-game. It's just such a fun transitional point from early game to mid game, that 1v1 with the people on the suburban side and the factory side. And you'd expect it to be really annoying considering that there's only 1 point to get from one side to the other, but actually there's multiple. You can take the more risky route, which is the bridge, or you can take a slightly risky but more safe route, which is the canal. Considering how many crates are down here, it does make for a pretty interesting rotation spot. But also, on top of both those points, there's a zip line that goes from one side of the location directly to the other just west of the Slurp factory. And the canal does make for a really cool drop spot considering how many containers there are. It makes you... It's easy to take cover, I guess, but it's still quite risky. And also going back to the suburban area, there's these little factory type buildings, I guess you could call it, scattered around on the like coastal areas of the canal, which they do host not as many chests as the main suburban buildings themselves, but it's still an extremely viable drop spot. Overall, I do think this location is definitely one of the best Epic has ever designed, and I really hope that they continue to design more locations like this and Faulty Splits in the future. There's so many positives about the POIs this chapter that I would honestly be here for an hour explaining the best possible drops and how to play at Slappy Shores or Faulty Splits and how to avoid getting killed. So if you guys do want to see something like that, like the video, possibly even subscribe. Even if you didn't like the video, then hit the dislike button because it still helps push the videos into the YouTube algorithm, which does help me in the long term. But overall, I hope you learned something about your favorite Fortnite Chapter 4 drop spot from this, and with that said, peace out.